Hello, Seaside Shadows, and welcome to Cemetery Saturday. I hope you are all having a fabulous week. It is a beautiful weekend here in Connecticut, though it is starting to get a bit warmer than I would prefer. I am ready for fall, and I'm sure many of you are ready for fall too. Today we are coming to you from Coventry, Connecticut in the Nathan Hale Cemetery. And you may have noticed that we definitely have an affinity for the Revolutionary War in Seaside Shadows. And this cemetery is definitely in keeping with that particular theme that we have such affection for. And a lot of it has to do with what a big part Connecticut played in the American Revolution and the amount of pivotal figures that we had that were supporting the patriot cause and that were integral to the success that are right here from the Nutmeg State. And Nathan Hale Cemetery is probably one of the places you would think of with some people who were at the heart of the Revolution, whose family had endless impacts upon Connecticut, and especially in regards to pursuing freedom. Now, many of you are familiar, likely, with the story of Nathan Hale. And though we're going to introduce you more specifically to one of his brothers today, who's a bit lesser known, I want to introduce you to the Hale family and give you a quick recap on why you may know of them, why Nathan Hale's the state hero, and why this entire family is someone that we chose to spend Cemetery Saturday with today. Now, Nathan Hale is, of course, the state hero, just a young man at 21 when he died. The legacy of the Hale family here in Connecticut really starts with his parents, Richard and Elizabeth. Richard Hale came to Connecticut from Massachusetts. The Hale family's pretty well known up there. He comes and settles here in Coventry, Connecticut, upon hundreds of acres of land, and he builds a small homestead for him and his wife, Elizabeth Strong, who had grown up not far from the property that he had acquired. They immediately start their family as well as their farm life, and Richard Hale endeavors on a variety of careers, getting involved in the church, getting involved in the community, and getting involved in merchant business. And he became a man from just mediocre means to a man of pretty well-to-do means, who was able to afford a nice lifestyle for his family. But that was after years of working hard on the farm and years of building his reputation. So for a while, Richard and Elizabeth were living in a two-room house, traditional for many families of the 18th century, where Elizabeth would give birth to 12 children in two-room house. Now, two of those children sadly would die in infancy. One was a twin to another of the children, and the last child that would die in infancy would also cause the death of dear Elizabeth, who died from complications of that childbirth. Now, Richard Hale was good friends with the local Adams family, and there was a widow of the Adams family he was well acquainted with named Abigail. Abigail Adams, not to be confused with the Abigail Adams, but still a very fabulous lady, I am sure. And Richard and Abigail agreed that due to their friendship, it would make sense for them to get married. Abigail had many daughters, and Richard had this prospect. Not only did he have a lot of sons, and some of them would, of course, intermarry or at least intercourt one another, but Richard had just finished, or had almost just finished, the start of his brand new house. And it was not two rooms. It was several rooms where people could have their own space, where they could wander around. It was a grand colonial home that still stands in Connecticut today, the Nathan Hale Homestead, which is managed by Connecticut Landmarks and where you can take a tour. But it was a fabulously large house that was great for the budding family. And it's important that we know that this would still be a crowded house. At one time, there were 25 people living in it, because it wouldn't just be parents and children, but also the grandchildren. So the house is finished around 1776. But sadly, around this time that the house has just finished being completed, the Hale family is marked by immeasurable tragedy. Now, you see, in the early 1700s, the patriot cause was starting to weigh on the Hales. There were a lot of boys of a young age who were supportive of the patriot cause. And they were from this area of Connecticut that was a patriot area. Now, Nathan Hale and his brother Enoch were privileged enough to be able to attend Yale University. The dad kind of picked which ones seemed to favor academics more than the other. And those two boys thrived at Yale. And it was there that Nathan Hale met Benjamin Talmadge, who you may remember from Cemetery Saturday, episode 1 up in Litchfield. Well, Benjamin Talmadge got involved in the Patriot cause first and would write a letter to his good friend Nathan, kind of endearing him to the cause and wanting to fight as well. So Nathan Hale does enroll as a Patriot soldier and ends up becoming a captain in the war. He's also inspired by his brothers John and Joseph and Billy and Richard Jr. have all also enlisted to fight. A total of 6 of the 12 children, so 6 of the boys enlist to fight. The only 2 that do not are ministers, Enoch and David. So they have a religious path ahead of them. And Samuel Hale was another brother who would enlist. So 6 of the boys are patriots. Nathan's following in his family's and his best friend's footsteps. But Nathan Hale does take up the cause for being a spy. George Washington is in need of intelligence of the British troops, and he puts out several requests looking for people to volunteer to be a spy. It was not something that many people wanted to volunteer to do at all, but after a couple of requests from the good general himself, Nathan Hale volunteers for the position. This was, of course, not looked upon fondly by his friends or anyone that knew him. Nathan Hale was an innocent guy. His only professional experience had been as a school teacher. He didn't seem like he'd be incredibly good at lying about who he was, but he wanted to follow the cause that his family was and stand up for what he believed in. So he took the cause of spy. He goes to New York, escorted at first across the river and the Sound by his friend Stephen Hempstead, and he makes it to New York and pretends to be this poor Dutch man who is just, innocently living his life there as he grabs British intelligence. He's caught pretty quickly by a man named Robert Rogers. There's many accounts of how he was caught, but collectively it seems to be that most historians agree that Nathan Hale was rather loose-mouthed in a tavern. Robert Rogers was already suspicious, and having gained that confirmation being in the tavern that night, he puts out the arrest for Nathan Hale. He's the one who arrests him, and he does this on the orders of course, General Howe from the British military, and Nathan is executed within just days following this on September 22nd at just 21 years of age. At the same time that this happens, his brothers some of them are actually fighting in New York and don't realize that this is happening in New York City at the same time. Nathan Hale, the school teacher, the academic, the advocate for women's rights, and then the martyr spy of the revolution, the first one that would take up the cause. And if you don't know him from that story, you'll know him perhaps from what was told to be his last words. He was a fan of Cato at Yale. And before he was executed, when he was allowed to say one more thing, he said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." And you saw that on the marker at the beginning of this clip. And that shows you the integrity of what Nathan Hale believed and who he was. Now, his brothers did try to come get his body in the days after the execution, but they were not allowed to. Nathan Hale's actual burial remains unknown, somewhere in New York City. Many believe it's probably close to Wall Street. And the Sons of the American Revolution actually have a couple markers in New York City on where he is proposed to be buried, or at least theoretically supposed to be. So when you saw that large monument at the intro to this video, and when we looked down the way from Joseph and we see this beautiful engraved stone down here for Nathan Hale, it's important to know that his physical body was not brought back home, but this shows you the love and affection his family had for him and how much they wanted to commemorate who he was. The family. Now, Nathan was one of the middle children of the family. He had several other older brothers, including Samuel, John, who would take over the estate, and Joseph, who I'm going to introduce you to today. I'm walking right now by Billy. If anyone's from Lebanon, Connecticut, Billy would actually settle there before he too died of a young age, just like dear Joseph did. All but one of the boys would die from causes of the Revolutionary War at some point in their lives. Samuel, who's on the other side, suffered PTSD most of his life. Billy, who settled in Lebanon and worked as a blacksmith, actually went on to suffer from consumption, as did Richard Jr., and as did Joseph, the gentleman I'm here to introduce you to today. It's funny that I pick him. I think we all have an affinity when we pick particular families to study, that we're drawn to certain individuals. And we always like the stories of people who maybe weren't previously known, and that can attract a lot of us as well. But if you've ever felt a spiritual connection to a story you've read in history, you know what I'm talking about. And though I connect with all of the Hales, and I think Nathan would have been a stand-up young man to meet, there's something about Joseph. There seems to be a grit to his story, an authenticity, and a loyalty that has always attracted me to his story. Now, Joseph actually did start off ever the fighter in the Revolution, and he didn't marry until after, towards the end of the war. And he served in the Revolution starting when he was 26 years old. He answered the call of the Lexington Alarm in 1775, as did 4 of his brothers. So 5 of them answered the Lexington Alarm. The only one who hasn't quite answered that yet is Nathan. He's waiting on Talmage's inspiration for the alarm. Now, after he would serve and answer to the Lexington Alarm, Joseph goes on to serve as a corporal in the company that marched from his hometown in Coventry up to Massachusetts. And he stays in that company that's from Connecticut. Now, as he serves as a corporal in there, he begins participating in the besieging of Boston. And in 1776, he was an ensign in Colonel Ward's regiment, which joined Washington's army later in New York. This brings him to be stationed at Fort Lee, where he then marches, and I mean literally marches. These men are not on horseback. They're walking all these miles. He then marches from the Boston area, after he makes it to Fort Lee, to White Plains. And from then on, he makes his way to New Jersey, where he participates in battles at Trenton and Princeton. He's encamped with Washington himself at Morristown. So he's really in the heart of it, the thick of it. He's in the first battles, the ones where Washington's learning what's going on. They're bloody, the brutal. It looks like the British are going to win. But Joseph is there. He's in the heart of it, and he's rising in the ranks. In 1777, he was promoted to lieutenant, or as we may have called him, lieutenant, in a Connecticut militia regiment commanded by Colonel John Ely. And in 1781, he served as the lieutenant in a provisional regiment in New London, which was ordered by the General Assembly to be put into work at a moment's notice. So after years of being boots on the ground, he also had to be the one that would up and leave. While he's stationed in New London, however, around the age of 28 and 29 is when he meets the woman he would come to marry. And that, of course, is Rebecca Harris. Now, when he marries her, they do start a family, and they have 3 girls together. And the 3 girls would grow with him for a few years in their youthful age. But although he gets married at 29 into a well-to-do family, good for him, sadly, he's already sick. It's become quite evident that he's turning a bit pale, a bit gaunt. He's coughing up blood. Now, he's familiar with what he's experiencing. He's watched Richard Jr. already migrate further south in hopes to heal his own consumption, tuberculosis. He's watched his brother Billy start to come down with the same symptoms. He too was exposed to the same conditions that would cause consumption. These men are on the front lines, and when it starts to sound like tales of glory and promotions and fighting against the evil redcoats, we forget the dingy conditions that these men are living in. Multiple men sleeping nearly on top of each other just to keep warm, eating out of the same pot, eating old moldy food, never bathing, walking miles upon miles a day. They're exposed to the elements and bacteria and everything you can imagine, and they get these terrible diseases like dysentery and tuberculosis. More men would die of disease in the revolution than would actually die of battle wounds. Now, Joseph had, sadly, his share of both being exposed to these conditions, but also being a prisoner of war himself, who spent time captured on a war ship and then having to be released. And of course, you know how prisoners of war would have been treated and kept in the dark and kept in these dank places. Sadly, at age 34, Mr. Joseph Hale would pass away, and he passed away in the family home here in Coventry, where he had moved back to with his wife and his children. He had retired by the war's end, had been able to see the freedom encountered by the country, and then would lose his life at such a tender young age, and his wife would go on to raise their children, who have many descendants in the area today who go on to tell their story. But one thing I said that struck me is loyalty, and you can see loyalty to his country and everything he believes in with that military background. But there was a loyalty to his family that I think went severely understated. And if you look at old family records and diaries and letters, there's a lot of letters from Joseph home to his father. And in those, he states that he goes to see Nathan and that he worries about him and he worries about his other brothers and that he wants to be home and helping his dad. And if you read Nathan Hale's diary itself, which is housed at the Connecticut Historical Society in Hartford, he documents several times, "My brother came by today, I was told at camp. He wanted to see me. He wanted to talk to me. And one time he saw him, but the last time, just days before Nathan would walk to the gallows, he missed him by just a second, having been out doing some other mission." Now, Joseph wanted to protect his family and his brothers and his children, and was known to have that soft side to him. But there's also that worker to him. He was known to be the farmer, working hard there, and just not trying to go to college or be something he didn't fit. His dad didn't think he was the academic type. He was the worker. He was the soldier. He was the family man. And I think there's something about that that is awe-inspiring. Now, the Hale family is filled with individual stories, and honestly, I could stand here all day probably talking about them and gushing over how inspirational they are. But I think everyone deserves their time. And I hope today you give Joseph a little bit of time in your mind. Joseph Hale, who would respond without question to the alarm, who would rise the ranks, who would march miles, who would become a dad, and who would be a brother and a son, and who would do everything he could to carry on the legacy of his family that he believed in. So think of Joseph today on this Cemetery Saturday. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And please do remember that at Seaside Shadows, we are still running our tours and events. We have lots of fantastic things going on. Please visit seasideshadows.com and click our calendar for details. If you would like more information on the Hales, specifically hauntings in relation to the Hales and as also their history, please visit our online store where you can get a copy of Revolutionary War Ghosts of Connecticut, and I will absolutely sign it for you. They're near and dear to my heart, so they are Chapter 1. And hopefully someday you'll make it here to meet the Hale family and see the beautiful memorial in Nathan's honor. So we'll give you one more glance around the cemetery. Have a great rest of your day.